The superhero genre is a pretty empty genre. I thought this was pretty good. It's caused an immense outcry among conservatives because they play up the fact that Superman is an alien. He becomes who he is because his parents' message is garbled. The film is completely a commentary on should we intervene in Russia, Ukraine, or Israel, Gaza. It suggests that every moral act is also a political act. My criticism would be it's a very individualist ethic. Huge conglomerates have taken over the studios, has made them immensely conservative. I think you get this Nietzschean eternal return of the same. It's this desire to stay in the infantilized zone, and I think it ties to us being in a post-literate society.
Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. My guest today is Todd McGowan. He's a film theorist, philosopher, and professor at the University of Vermont. He has a particular fascination with Hegel, Lacan, and all things psychoanalysis, interests that I share, though in my much less erudite way. And he's the author of many fantastic books, including most recently two on excess and alienation, concepts that we'll get into during this video. He is also the author of the best book ever written, I think, about my favourite director, David Lynch. It's called The Impossible David Lynch, and I'd highly recommend it. I'm thrilled to say he joins me live for his inaugural appearance on the UnHerd channel. Professor McGowan, welcome to UnHerd.
Flo, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for that really generous introduction. I don't think that's probably true about that book, but I'll accept it anyway.
We gave you the slightly punishing task of going out and watching the new Superman film. I am a complete innocent when it comes to superhero films, and so treat me as one. But this Superman film has certainly caused a stir. It feels like it has dominated the kind of cultural commentary sphere for the last few weeks, and it's getting lots of polarized views from all sides of the spectrum, political and otherwise. So I thought I might just start by asking you what your response to the film was. What did you think of it?
So I have twins and they grew up in this era. So I unfortunately was, willing or not, a consumer of all the Superman movies or superhero movies. And I've finally gotten free from that. And then I'm like, it's like Godfather 2. I got free and you pulled me back in. I sort of share your view that the superhero genre is a pretty empty genre. I thought this was pretty good. I thought it had a couple things to say. It's interesting that I don't know about around the world, but here in the US, it's caused an immense outcry among conservatives because they play up the fact that Superman is an alien and then he's shipped to an offshoring prison, which is an interesting commentary. And also, I think one of the things this is the part I liked about it, that he has a certain mission that he comes to Earth with, and he becomes who he is because, and this, I appreciate the psychoanalytic insight here, that his parents' message is garbled and he hears, that's not giving anything away, he interprets the garbled message like he wants to interpret it, not what it actually says. And we learn later what it actually says. So I thought that was pretty great as a way to think about all of the way that we're all responding to a message given to us by whoever raises us. And the message is always metaphorically garbled. And then how we respond to it, that's how we are. That defines our singularity.
In the Freudian context, this would be like a process of individualization.
Yeah, exactly. And the fact that that the message is never fully clear, right? I like that idea that even when your parents think they're giving you a clear message, there's always unconscious elements, desires behind it, and then your unconscious interprets that in its own way. So I thought that was good.
Why do so many adults love these films? This is my continual bafflement about the Marvel universe. Adults who I know, they will have gone to see these films, and I always wonder why. You know, many of them do not have children like you have for the, last decade or so who need to be taken to these things. Otherwise they're going to be left out at school when everyone's talking about it.
Right. It's not like reading Kant's groundwork of the metaphysic of morals in terms of ethical life, right?
It's not, no.
That is true. I think it's interesting to think about the history of that genre, the superhero genre. And I think the real genre that presaged it is the Western. And it also had the same very simplistic kind of ethical thing to it. And it had this incredible, so at the height of the Western from the beginning of the talkie in 27 to about 1956, just dominated cinema, kind of in the way, even more than the way superhero films dominate today. And there's a certain moral clarity, but what I think what people like about it is that we see the inadequacy of the law to deal with criminality and injustice, right? And so what the Western and what the superhero give us is this figure that's an exception to the law that then is able to bring into line these criminal elements that seem otherwise out of control. So I think that, to me, that's the nature of the appeal of those kind of things.
And then the criminal elements change over time so that they match up with the kind of period that the superhero movie is coming out in, whether that's gangsters in the days of kind of Al Capone, all the way through to now in the current Superman, where there is a question of a foreign war. And the big ethical dilemma at the center of the film, this isn't a spoiler to say, is whether or not being an interventionist in that foreign war is an act of good or ill, I suppose, and which seems like a very prescient thing to be dealing with given the current state of American politics right now.
Right. The film is completely a commentary on, should we intervene in Russia, Ukraine, or Israel, Gaza, right? Like it is absolutely, and it plays a little fast and loose because you can't tell, is it talking about Russia, Ukraine, or is it talking about Israel, Gaza? And it really, it sends contradictory, I think purposely, obviously, contradictory signs about that. So yeah, I think it's really asking that question. And the other thing interesting about the film is that it suggests that every moral act is also a political act. And I think a lot of times we don't want to think that. We want to think, oh, I'm just going to live my moral life and not think about the larger political context. But Lois Lane early in the film confronts Superman with this fact that if you're going to try to do something moral, it always is going to have political consequences.
What do you think the kind of takeaway message is that James Gunn, the director, intended? I mean, there's been a lot of confusion, I suppose, about his intended takeaway from this film.
I think the idea is that we have to take the risk to act politically, right? Like if you can't just confine yourself to a certain moral position within a society, you have to be willing to act. Like, I mean, it's almost send arms to Ukraine kind of film, I think, really. I mean, I think it's really that kind of, and I think actually the right wing response is he really pushed back against that and said, oh, it's just a film about kindness. Okay. What if it was a film about kindness, no one would go to see it, right? Because it would be, I don't know, would it be like, what was that dinosaur that was purple or whatever? I don't even remember what the name of it.
Yeah, Barney.
Barney, right. That's no one goes to see that. I think he's trying to play a little fast and loose, and rightfully so, perhaps. But I think it really is that he kind of deserves, if you're a conservative, the criticism that he's getting for the film.
What would be your criticism then on the other side of the film from a leftist perspective? Where would you find fault in that film?
My criticism would be the criticism I have of all superhero films is that it requires this, it's a very individualist ethic, right? That requires this figure that has something that allows them to defy law or restriction or anything, and then they're able to act. And then it doesn't see the way in which we can all collectively act. I think so. So that would be that would be my criticism, but it's not. It's a pretty minor criticism. I liked the film, and I thought it was pretty. I thought it was pretty good, other than the fact that it was a superhero film, which you and I were just, I think we share the same feeling about that.
Maybe even 10 years ago, even more recently, perhaps, the idea of the immigrant done good, the alien, who makes a go of it, was a pretty universally loved trope in American film. Right. And now, under Trump's government, there does seem to be a very different patina and a very different conversation happening about whether even a kind of immigrant done good story can be told in American cinema right now. Did you have reflections on the kind of immigrant line in that film and what the new resonance it has?
Yeah, I mean, everything you said is absolutely correct. That that gives the film the sense of radicality that otherwise it's just a regular, ordinary Hollywood film. But precisely because our situation has so dramatically changed, and just the incredible violence done to immigrants just living their ordinary life. It's not like immigrants that are, Trump was like, we're going to put all the criminals in. It's not criminals. It's people living ordinary lives. And there's been, I think, a good deal of outrage about it, but it's interesting that this film would register that a film would register that. But I think you're right to say 10 years ago, it'd just be a garden variety kind of thing, other than the fact that he gets his jailing gets outsourced. And that seemed to me pretty tendentiously making in a good way, political point. So, but otherwise, I think you're right. It's kind of standard immigrant made good story.
I mean, it's also one in a list of prequels, sequels, and then remakes more recently. There have been so many remakes in the last year alone. There's been the kind of new Snow White live action, Lilo and Stitch, another Smurfs film. There appears to be a kind of real phase of remakes. What do you think's happening in the culture where we can be only 5 years out from the last Superman film and already coming back to a remake, already returning to the same character, the same basic plot? Is it that we literally have so few ideas that we have to return to something that's so recent, or what's gone on that means that there's so much regurgitation going on now in the kind of current culture?
I'm going to answer this in a way that I don't necessarily like. That I think it's because I usually hate this appeal to the socio-economic or the economic forces alone, but I do think that the way that streaming and other forces have really taken over and just huge conglomerates have taken over the studios has made them immensely conservative. And so I think the chances of a film getting that to get greenlit, I think there has to be this guarantee of a certain audience. And they think if we're regurgitating the thing, there's a guarantee of an audience. This never happened to me before, but I was in the film Materialists. I don't know if you know this one. And I started and it seemed like this is a weird beginning, and it didn't seem like it was about, I knew what Materialists is about. It's about a couple in New York, 3 people in New York. And it turned out to be the beginning of the live action version of How to Train Your Dragon. They had put the wrong film on. And so
quite confusing experience when the dragon comes on instead of...
And someone actually sat through the whole thing. They didn't, I guess, notice. But I thought, like, why this, to me, the thing that drives me the craziest is this live action phenomenon where they take something successful as a cartoon and then make a live action
Lilo and
version.
Stitch and Snow White in recent years. Yeah. I mean, also Lilo and Stitch, I think particularly is an interesting example because the animation was, really sweet in the first go around, and also really quite recent. It's not like the Disney classic, Snow White being a good example, which has that much older style of animation.
I know, and what the funny thing is, these films never do as well as the original animation film, but I guess they do well enough that they accede to what the studio is demanding. But there's a certain sense of like don't you think this is probably true, that everything's spiraling out of control. There's no sense to things, but at least I can hold back onto these things that seem certain, like the superhero.
The comfort of nostalgia. And I suppose for parents who've had children who are probably my age, they would have grown up seeing Lilo and Stitch in the cinema when they were themselves children, and now they can bring back their children to see it. It almost feels like a comfort blanket of some time warp that's happened where actually nothing's really moved on. You can take your kids now, age 3 or 4, to see Lilo and Stitch at the same time you saw it when you were 3 or 4. It's kind of comforting to think that nothing's happened,
It's a great point. Yeah, I think it's just a great point by you that it really is true that there's a sense of this. I think that the word that you use, nostalgia, is really the right word, right? That you can have this nostalgic response to something, even though it's new, but of course it's not new. And then you can imagine that, I mean, obviously there were terrible problems in the early 2000s, but compared to today, it seemed like at least you could get a handle on them. I think it's a hard thing to live with intractable problem. Like the warming issue, I think, is a real, I mean, obviously there's the rise of fascism around the planet, which is horrifying, but I think the climate disaster is something that people feel like there's nothing we can do about it. And so we retreat into this nostalgic move, I think, or mode. Yeah.
There is an interesting question here maybe about the way in which this will affect culture, because the culture that you see when you're young will impact inevitably the kind of culture you make if you become someone who engages with a creative life. if you're just seeing a regurgitation of the culture your parents saw or your grandparents saw, what's that going to do to the generation of kids who are growing up watching Lilo and Stitch Mark II rather than anything new, anything progressive or challenging to their kind of worldview? They will just be in a kind of time warp with their parents where they have no difference in the culture between the two of them.
Right. I think that's true. I think you get this in a way that he never would have imagined, what the kind of Nietzschean eternal return of the same, right? Like you get no point at which you get out of that loop. And so you just continue to produce things in that loop. I think that's really true. I also think that it's so, there's so few, we talked about David Lynch at the beginning. There's so few creative auteurs that have a real impact on the culture that I worry that aspiring filmmakers or television makers, they don't have that, like, who would they look to say, that's my inspiration? Is it the person that directed Superman? That seems kind of sad to me. Like when I was a kid, you could look to, I don't know, Stanley Kubrick, Spike Lee, somebody like that. And now that those figures aren't, I mean, Spike Lee is still alive, but basically those figures aren't around or prominent in the culture.
And Martin Scorsese, of course, who is one of those figures for many people, has spoken quite harshly about superhero franchises and particularly about the James Gunn films. And I suppose there is a question there about where the critics are going to come from as well. If there is just this kind of heaped adulation on the creators of the Marvel universe, which almost universally there seems to be, it's actually, you know, quite hard to find a cinema, even independent cinemas are showing these new Marvel releases because they need to bring in the people to survive. So it's going to be harder and harder to find anyone also who's willing to do a kind of full critique of that. And then, of course, the Scorseses and the Lynches inevitably die off. And what comes after is the question I really have.
It's just interesting to me because, so Orson Welles is, to me, the greatest filmmaker ever. And I always wish that he had lived when Lynch lived, because then he could have had a space to make films and not be destroyed by Hollywood. But it's like there was a little sweet spot where Lynch could live, and now we're past that. And so there isn't that space anymore where you can do the kind of thing that he did, or what, I mean, again, Spike Lee would be another great example, but there's a ton of examples where there's not real, and even if you can make the films, I think that's the point you're getting at, they're not going to get they're not going to be screened. They're just going to be going straight to streaming, which is not the way to see a film, especially an art film. I don't know if you feel this way, but I always feel like a stupid action superhero film you can watch on your phone, it's fine. But a real art film that requires you to really get into the film, you have to see it on the hugest screen possible. I once saw Fellini's 8.5 on a huge screen, and I thought, this is just a stunning film. And then the next 2 months later, I showed it to my class, and they saw it on the whatever size, and they thought, this is the most boring thing I've ever seen. And that just made sense to me, because you need to see those films in a way that you can be immersed into them.
That's the other thing I'm really interested in is the quality seems to be significantly lower than it used to be, of basic levels of CGI, of dialogue, of character building, story, just things that used to be entirely central to the art of the film director and the screenwriter seem to have really gone to the wayside, been put to one side so that more can be produced. You know, now it's about quantity, not quality, to use the kind of cliche.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that the more there's emphasis on just getting the thing out there and making it big or whatever, the less emphasis there is on narrative. And I think one of the real ways this makes itself felt is that if you look at how many people wrote some of these films, there's 10 writers. And so it's just been rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. And so you don't get anyone's voice really in the film. Television's a slight exception to this. So I think there are avenues in television still that you can make some kind of impact and really have a vision, and it can be singular.
The question of the infantilization of the audience as well is interesting in the context of these superhero films, because of course, by its nature, it has a very simplistic ethic. It is designed for children as well as adults to watch, and so it has to be readable to the child's mind. But I think that must also do something to the adult's mind in the room. Because if you're constantly engaging with culture that is designed, at least partly, for children's consumption, then you might take on, by extension, a kind of childlike view of the world. And while I would always be an advocate for someone having a kind of blissfully naive view, I think actually David Lynch is a good example of someone who did enjoy almost a childlike view of reality. I think there could probably be some downsides and some risks to indoctrinating large portions of the population with children's literature, effectively.
Well, you know what's really interesting about that, Flo, is that now at universities, children's literature is a real... it has a major place in the curriculum. So I think that and I can't tell you how many students I have. This happened, it's a little less now because the books are no longer as popular as they were, but I'd have students come in and say, I think the greatest novel ever written was Harry Potter and I don't know, something, Order of Phoenix or whatever it is, right?
Well, something else getting a remake as well. Yet another remake and a litany of remakes.
That's true. But I would just say, look, that's an embarrassing answer. You can't really say that. And I think that seemed to me symptomatic of what you're talking about. When you said the thing about Lynch, it showed that there's a kind of misunderstanding of childhood, right? Because childhood isn't just this simplistic thing. It's also a confrontation with a certain kind of horror that he gets at in Blue Velvet or something like that, right?
Yeah, Lynch actually has real childhood imagination, which is quite scary and horrible and dark. And then, James Gunn, I think, is giving a Hollywood child.
Yeah, and I think I think it's a simplistic version of childhood, but I also think it is, I think you're right that it's this desire to stay in the infantilized zone. And I think it ties to us being in a post-literate society, because to be literate is to be forced to confront the word and all the problems that come with that. And I think that by staying in childhood, you're trying to avoid that kind of problem.
I suppose as a kind of someone who reads a lot of Freud and Lacan and the rest, you probably have a sense of this, but how does the increasing infantilizing of students, young adults, basically, that strange time in our lives where we're supposed to make a transition between being in the home and then being in the world, how has that affected this? Because you're teaching students around that age, and it's something I've talked to lots of people about. Jonathan Haidt quite recently, about his book about the anxious generation, about the fact that there does seem to be a real epidemic of fearfulness amongst these young people about making a transition from being children to being adults. And I wonder how you perceive that.
Yeah, I think it's been so evident, right? So a couple things. So one thing is the total addiction to the phone or the apparatus, right? And so I have to, in my classes, I ban absolutely no computer, no phone, just because otherwise they can't, it's impossible for them to pay attention. So and then I have students to come to me afterward and say, thank you so much for banning that because it really allowed me to have the class. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is this notion of the mental health day. I'm sure you've heard, like I'll have students that will just miss class and they'll say, it was a mental health day for me. And I said, oh, I would have liked to take those when I was at undergrad too, but there was no such thing. We weren't allowed to do that. I think that's a sign of this kind of like just anxiety sense of like, I can't make it through. And then the third thing is that when I started teaching 30 years ago, I assigned at least twice as much reading as I do now. And not because I've gotten softer, but just because they just simply couldn't do it. So that's, to me, just from my perspective, that's the saddest thing, is the way in which and I see it with my twins, even the way in which the phone is, even when they want to read, it's just, there's some pull to that takes them away from that. And I'm kind of a romantic. I feel like if we should all read more books, and then things would be better.
I suppose the one genre that you might be able to say has moved forward or had a kind of progression over the last 10 years as opposed to a stagnation is the horror genre, which is interesting in the context of our conversation about David Lynch as well, because of course horror has been historically denigrated as a kind of not serious brand of filmmaking, much like superhero films have also. I'm doing it now. But in recent years, with directors like Jordan Peele and Ari Aster and these big production houses like A24, it seems that there has been a shift.
I think you're right that the art film and the auteur, the film auteur, right? That's what we're talking about. That's who David Lynch is. That's who really almost horror is the only outlet for that figure. I've now give you this other standard Marxist answer to this, but I think a lot of it is economic, that it's because horror films are really cheap to make. And the other thing is they make money. So you can make a horror film for almost nothing. You can put it in a theater and then tons of people, it makes back 3, 4, 5 times what it cost to make it on the first week. So I think that's part of why I do think I hate horror films, just not for any generic reason, but just because I'm scared. I can't go to them. I have one son who wants to be a film screenwriter, and he loves horror, and he just thinks it's a terrible failing on my part. His idea is that horror is the way in which we're really exploring the just like you're saying, what our contemporary situation is. You know, if these other genres like superheroes are retreating from that contemporary situation, horror is really engaging it. My feeling with horror always was that there was a kind of deep, maybe, I know this is wrong. I'm just justifying my own dislike, my own fear, that there's a fear of the other in horror. And so that it kind of makes people, I said, my son got so mad when I said this. I said, you go to Heredity in the morning and then you vote for Trump in the afternoon, right? Like there's a kind of like, and he's like, you don't understand anything. Just stop talking. But that was my fear. And I think that I understand that that's wrong, but that was my sense. But I think everything you said about horror, I agree with that it is this avenue now where people are doing this serious, thoughtful filmmaking that maybe doesn't have another genre where it's possible, right? I can't think of one.
No, I don't think so. I think maybe science fiction for a while had a bit of that energy, and perhaps it lost it because we entered into a world that had too far exceeded the imaginings of science fiction, that like the most crazy hypothesis of a science fiction film is, you know, seems a bit retro now. I think there's an interesting thing maybe about horror as well, where it channels some of these other things we're talking about, the infantilization, the anxiety that people are feeling. Perhaps actually in some ways horror does the inverse, but also the same as the superhero film, where the superhero film gives you a feeling of being in a warm bath where a guy is coming to sort things out, to intervene in the foreign war or to save you from the gangsters. In the horror film, you can let go to the kind of chaos of the reality of where the world is at. And it's actually almost like a therapeutic thing to immerse yourself in the worst possible scenario.
Does that work for you? I mean, because let me just tell you, I accidentally I went along. I don't know. I agreed to go. I did agree. I wasn't grabbed and abducted, but I saw this movie, Paranormal Activity. I saw that, and then I didn't have any catharsis. I spent the next month, I couldn't even go to sleep. So I wonder, does that work for you, that catharsis?
I'm not a particularly anxious person, so I never really know. I maybe have a slightly other reason for enjoying it, which is that I enjoy films that are directly intended to make you feel uncomfortable, which is why I like a lot of David Lynch's work, because so much of it is actually obviously confrontational in its nature. I find horror to be the most obviously confrontational genre. In its essence, of course, it's designed to make you feel bad. You know, no one would consider fear particularly to be a good feeling. And so what that really does to you as an audience member, I think is interesting. Maybe I'm entering into a kind of meta theatrical analysis of the horror genre where I am both subject and object and all the rest. So, you know, maybe.
Yeah, no, but that's good, I think, because my sense always was to choose to go to a horror film is like getting ready to go to bed and saying, I hope I have a nightmare tonight. And that never made any sense to me because I don't know about other people. I don't really like it when I have a nightmare.
But here you go. I like it when I have a nightmare because if you're in any sort of, you know, Jungian analysis, you think, oh, good, this is good. to make for a good, interesting session. So in a similar, I have a similar feeling when I walk into a cinema to see a horror film. I almost feel that I'm cracking my knuckles and preparing for the onslaught in a way, and the revelation that comes from that.
Yeah, well, this comes back to the student thing, because my students love my spouse teaches a class. She feels like I do about horror films, but to steel herself against them, she teaches a class on them. And once the thing drops for student registration, it's filled, right? So what is that? Like, that seems really interesting to me, that this generation that, as you just were saying, is filled with more anxiety, that can't read, that can't pay attention. Something about the horror film really, it sucks them in, right? Like there's something that really speaks to them in a way that it didn't speak to my generation. A horror film was fine. People watched them, but it wasn't a thing when I was growing up in the 80s.
The earlier horror movies were more visceral and gore-based, whereas the contemporary ones seem to be much more psychological, much more based on, the fear of the unknown, the big other, as you say, and that kind of anxiety. Actually, they are, many of them, based on anxiety rather than fear. Fear is like a bit too brash and a bit too crass, Anxiety is chic and subtle, and it sits under everything, and everyone has it. So
and that speaks to what that's the predominant affect. I think
it must be the zeitgeist. The affect of the moment is anxiety, and then it's picking up on that. And it's got that kind of ambient anxiety running through it. I don't know, maybe that's also why people are still attracted to superheroes, even into adulthood, is that it's the one figure, a bit like James Bond, the super spy, who is allowed to do away with ambient anxiety.
Because not to be too jargony, but the superhero isn't castrated, right? Like I think that's why she or he seems like they're not riven with anxiety, right? Because they're not subjected to any lack or castration. So I think that's it's interesting to think of this giant opposition between the superhero film on the one hand that's trying to cure us of anxiety, and then the horror film on the other hand that's really trying to explore it, right? I think that's what you're saying. And I think that seems probably right to me. Just speaking of that though, with the James Gunn film, this is again why I liked it though, because Superman actually, he's hurt in the beginning, so he can be damaged, but he's also sexual. Like he's in and this is, if people remember the Christopher Reeve, this Superman, I forget his name, but he's playing Christopher Reeve playing Superman. It's very evident that he is. Very famously in Superman 2, in I think 1980, he wants to get involved with Lois Lane, and to get involved, he has to give up his powers. It's this great moment. And then all of a sudden, these other people from Krypton have invaded Earth, and he has to go get his powers back. But then he can't have this relationship with Lois Lane. But in this one, they're just having sex. They're just a normal, they're just a couple, right? They're fighting like a couple. So I thought that was kind of interesting, because once you're sexual, then you can have anxiety, right? And so it almost is trying to bring something into that superhero figure that usually is not in there.
But then also maybe it's about attracting an audience who are suffering from a chronic lack of agency. That in a way, having agency in relationships and interpersonal interactions is as much attractive to an adult man sat in that cinema as a child is attracted to being able to fly, being able to shoot laser beams out of your eyes. That almost the kind of superpower of the modern age would be to have some degree of uncastrated agency.
Right. I think that's right. I think that would be the superpower. I was just, as you were talking though, I was thinking like maybe the real way it's appealing to the adult in the audience is, there can be a relationship with a woman, right? Like this guy because I really feel like, I was saying this to some female students of mine. I said, look, soon, because I don't know about if this is true in Britain, but here the ratio, it's almost like 70-30 in terms of at the university of women versus men. And so I was like, soon you're just going to have to either say, I'm not going to have a relationship at all, or I'm going to have to choose just accept someone stupid, because as a woman, I meant, because there's just, and so I thought it was interesting that here's like he's a journalist. He says, I also like, one thing I like about Superman, he has a job, he works. Some of these superheroes are just rich and they don't, and they like
he's
Batman
not like Batman, right? He's not in a kind of lair
Batman.
with a lovely car and a nice house.
Right.
And yeah.
Right. He's a journalist. I like that
Yeah.
he's a journalist.
I mean, that's not really a proper job, but it's a job-ish.
You don't think I think journalism's a good. Oh, you mean you got to be on the factory floor for it to count for a job?
Yeah, well, chipping away at the coalface of contemporary life. That's us. Before I let you go, I just want to ask you, I suppose, where excess and alienation, these two terms, these concepts that you write about in your last two books, where this might fit into this conversation we're having. Is this downstream of an excessive culture? Is it that we're so decadent that we've become stagnated because we can have as many movies as we want, and so we just run out of ideas? Or is there something else there? And then I just want to hear from you about alienation and why perhaps we might crave that alienation, in some way.
Yeah, I mean, my book is called Embracing Alienation, as you know, and I wonder, I think you've slyly put me in a terrible position where I'm going to have to defend the horror film as really philosophically aligned with my own position. Because if you think about the two genres that we've talked about, it does seem like the horror film is about embracing alienation in the way that you've described it. I have to take your word for it. The whole point of that book and one of the things I deeply believe is that rather than trying to overcome alienation in some way, we should be trying to find ways to embrace it. And the problem is that too often we're fleeing from it. And I think you're right that the image of pure excess in the figure of the superhero is one of the main ways. Obviously, the superhero is in a main way for most people, but when you're in those films, that functions as a main way to flee from that alienation. And I think that what you just said about agency and being able to act without castration, that really is one thing that the superhero promises. So I am a little bit upset that that's seemingly the way it worked out, that the horror film is really on the side of alienation and the superhero film's on the side of pure excess. But I do feel like the way you explained it, that makes sense. What you're calling this cultural stagnation, which I agree exists, I think that what's interesting is that it's driven to, I would say, it's driven by this promise of finding plenitude somewhere without some moment free from lack. And I think that's why nostalgia is so important today. Like, I want to get back to this time before I felt like I was just lacking being. And can I get back to that time of pure plenitude that never existed for any of us. No one had a good childhood, right? Even the person that had the best childhood.
Great. Well, we'll come back to you when the next Superman comes out in 5 years' time, and then we'll see if you like that one, and we'll continue every 5 years for the rest of time. Ad infinitum, the torture. I'll send you back and back and back, and your children will have retired, and you'll still be going to the Superman films.
Yeah. Well, at least if I'm alive, I'll be happy to go to Superman. So.
That's your punishment for staying around. Todd McGowan, thank you so much for your time today.
Flo, thank you so much. Take care.
Well, that was Professor Todd McGowan of the University of Vermont there, talking all things Superman, superheroes, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, stuck culture, the stagnation that we seem to find ourselves in when it comes to film in this contemporary age, and then also in the latter part of the interview, the new promise of horror, which I tried to sell to him there. I'm not sure he was quite convinced, but by the end there we got to the conclusion that perhaps between the dichotomy of excess and alienation, that superheroes fell on the side of excess, the decadence of modern culture, and that perhaps horror could offer an example to embracing the alienation that he is so fascinated by. Thanks to Todd for coming on the channel, to you for watching. This was UnHerd.